Hi everybody. So today joining me we have Dr. David C. Geary. Dr. Geary is a cognitive developmental and evolutionary psychologist. He is currently a Curators professor and Thomas Jefferson Fellow in the Department of Psychological Sciences and Interdisciplinary Neuroscience program at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. He is the author of several books, including Children's Mathematical Development, Male, Female, The Evolution of Human Sex Differences, and Evolution of Vulnerability, Implications for Sex Differences in Health and Development. Hi, Dr. Geary. Welcome to the program. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you on. To begin with, I noticed that in your work you talk a lot about some cognitive modules, and I want to focus particularly on three of them: folk psychology, folk biology, and folk physics. So, for folk psychology, I noticed that you say that its main components are the self, the person, referring to dyadic relationships, and the group. Could you explain what purposes serves each of these components of folk psychology and how they give basis to social cognition?
Sure. So the folk abilities in general refer to abilities that we see across human cultures that are universals. They are well developed in adults, but take a lot of experience during childhood to become fully developed. And I contrast those with school-based skills, such as reading, writing, mathematics, things that aren't universal, that are kind of built on the folk abilities. And then folk psychology refers to the kind of constellation of skills that allows one to be aware of oneself, which would include self-knowledge, self-schema, self-awareness, things that we all take for granted but are actually fairly unique among species. Humans are probably the only species, as far as we know, that can reflect on themselves as individuals, have knowledge of their personality, their likes, dislikes, and so forth. So chimpanzees recognize themselves physically, but whether they can reflect on their mental and social competencies is a different matter and debated. So that's the self component of folk psychology. The individual component are skills that allow one to maintain one-on-one interactions with other people and to form individual relationships, say friendships with others or relationships with individual family members. And these involve things that are well known, such as language, theory of mind, the ability to make inferences about the thoughts or feelings of other people, sensitivity to gesture, body language, vocal intonation, so forth. And I also put in there what I call a person schema. So you develop knowledge about each individual person, about what they like, how they respond to things, how warm they are, how agreeable, competent, and so forth. And you use that knowledge in how you frame interactions with them. So if you want to ask one person who's very agreeable about things to do something, you would do it one way. Somebody who tends to be argumentative, you would frame it a little bit differently, and you build up that personal knowledge. And then people are, as you know, very highly social species. And we can't develop individual relationships with everyone that we come in contact with or have frequent exposure to. And so we need to kind of parse social groups. The first parsing is in terms of kin. There's just a general cross-species bias for favorable treatment of kin, and we recognize that, and anthropologists have studied that extensively across cultures in terms of kind of the kin basis for social organization. Now, of course, people have non-kin relationships as well, but kin is central. Humans have a clear tendency to form in-groups and out-groups. So the in-groups would, of course, typically include kin, but would also include non-kin, allies, friends, acquaintances that you cooperate with, and so forth. And we have certain biases about how we evaluate in-group members. We kind of have favorable biases toward them. And then there are out-groups, usually defined in terms of, or often defined in terms of competing groups. So we cooperate with members of the in-group to help us better compete with other groups that we call the out-group. And that involves a variety of cognitions and other sorts of things about in-group members. Now, people are also very good and again, unique relative to other species in terms of their abilities to form large in-groups based on ideology. And in nature, if you look at other species where there's group-level competition, chimpanzees, for example, dolphins, lions, other sorts of things, the bigger the group, the better the competitive abilities. So generally larger groups, or almost always larger groups, outcompete smaller groups. So any mechanism that increased group size, if there's group level competition, would be favored by evolution. And I think that's where people's tendency to rally around ideologies, whatever they might be. They may be national, they may be religious, they may be, university affiliation, whatever it is. It increases group size and allows people that don't know each other to cooperate in ways that are mutually beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so how do these components of folk psychology interrelate with the development of theory of mind?
Yeah, so theory of mind is one component of folk psychology. As I mentioned, the individual level component allows us to make inferences about the thoughts and feelings of other individuals. And again, relative to other species, even closely related species, these are very highly developed skills in in humans, and even kids outdo chimpanzees. These skills they begin to develop during the preschool years and kind of continue to become refined and emerge up through adolescence. I think they're important to in terms of dealing with potential deception, because if you're a chimpanzee and something happens and you feel angry or happy or whatever, you're probably going to express it most of the time. And so the relation between what you're expressing socially and what you're feeling internally is pretty consistent. Maybe not always, but much of the time. But people are different. They can inhibit their social cues. They might feel one way but not want to express that, or they can express something that they don't really feel. And so this disconnect allows us to better manage social relationships, for good or for bad. And theory of mind is, in a sense, a counter to that. It allows us to kind of make an inference. Okay, is this person really feeling this way? I have to kind of decide, even though it's unclear.
Mm-hmm. And since you talked about in-group and out-group dynamics, what is your position, and since you also work in evolutionary psychology, what is your position in what refers to group selection? Does it have something to it, or don't you Don't you agree with it? Because I mean, there are people who defend cultural group selection, but when it comes to biological group selection, then the evidence doesn't seem to back it up. Let's say.
Yeah, I mean, some cultural groups are more successful at various points in history than others. Yeah, I think the unit of selection is the individual. I mean, that's how I think of it. Um, but clearly, people form large cooperative groups, and they often compete with other groups in that. And so, the way I think of it is in terms of individuals who are cooperative, are able to contribute, the conscientious or whatever, contribute to the group effort. It aids the group in one sense, but it also selects for those sort of group enhancing psychological, personality, or other traits at the individual level. So I think on the surface there is this group dynamic, but I think of it in terms of that group dynamic sets up selection pressures that favors increased cooperativeness among the groups, but then the real level of selection is still at the individual.
Okay, so and in terms of our evolutionary history and our survival, what would you say? First of all, what are the components of folk biology, and why was it important for us in terms of our evolutionary history?
Sure. So by folk biology, what I mean, and other people who study this, is people's either implicit or explicit understanding of how other species work. And so that would include knowledge of growing seasons of plants, if you're an agriculturalist, or fruiting trees, or whatever it is. And so if you're living in the real world, you have to get your own food. You can't go down to the Quickie Mart at night to buy something. And so you really need extensive knowledge about that in terms of when to find it, where to find it, how to prepare it, what not to eat, what you can use as medicines. A lot of these folk medicines actually have pharmaceutical effects. They can be effective. One very interesting study looked at folk biological knowledge in moms and the health and development of their children, and found that women with strong knowledge of folk medicines and general folk biology had better developing in terms of, say, height, and healthier children, suggesting that they could use this knowledge to facilitate the well-being of their kids, which is one way in which this would evolve. And the same is true for hunting. Hunting requires a lot of skill in terms of tracking animals, knowing their behavior, predicting where they're going to be, and so forth. So we really need this extensive knowledge to survive in natural contexts.
Right. And in terms of folk physics, I have two questions about it. First of all, again, why was it important in our evolutionary history, and in what ways did it help us to survive in this world? And on the other hand, would you say that because folk physics basically deals with the way we look at the world around us and how we deal with it physically, would you say that it gives us at least partially some of the basis to learn certain aspects of mathematics like geometry?
Yeah, good question. So folk physics involves a number of different things. One of them is just kind of moving around in the world. Being able to locate something you want and move from where you are to where that is. So basic kind of movement and here and now representation of physical space is one component of it. And you see that in lots of species. I mean, most species have basic kind of movement navigational types of skills. So nothing special there. And if we look at other primates, we're not any better than they are generally. People are better than other species in terms of mentally representing visual images, so and manipulating those. So if I asked you to draw a layout of your apartment or house or whatever, or a map of where you are and where you want to go next, you could do it. And so you're generating a mental image, often a bird's eye view of the larger environment, and forming a symbolic representation of that environment. And other species just can't do that. Chimps may be able to do a little bit of representation and hold it in memory, but they're not very good at it. But we're especially good at it. The folk physics also includes the ability or an implicit understanding of how to develop and use tools. Of course, some other species do have simple tools, but we're supreme in that. And so conceptually and kind of visually representing how an object might be used in one way or another way to achieve a particular goal, and how we would use our movements to use the tool in that way is something that humans are really good at. Chimpanzees are surprisingly bad at it. I mean, they can kind of figure things out by trial and error, how to use a stick to get something, but they don't have any conceptual insights regarding gravity or other types of physical phenomena that even young kids do. So it's very, very important.
And in terms of the basis it gives for us to learn certain aspects of mathematics, like geometry, for example, does it give us any basis or not?
Yeah, good question. So we do have an evolved kind of number sense, a sense of approximate quantity, that there's more here of that, berries or whatever, and there's less over here, and if we put these two together, we'd have, approximately this much more. So we do have that intuitive sense. Much of modern day mathematics, or probably the vast majority of it, is kind of culturally constructed. So very smart people have figured these things out over the last few thousand years, and it's kind of accumulated over time. And that's probably separate from our number sense. Now, it's probably the case that understanding certain aspects of mathematics, like geometry, for example, is easier if you can represent visually, spatially, two-dimensional space where you're plotting graphs in a XY axes, or three-dimensional space to kind of figure out where that point would be. So I think that the visual spatial stuff does aid in terms of how to represent these problems. Whether the visual spatial systems have an implicit understanding of geometry built into them, maybe. But it would probably be very simple. I think most of it is just learning to solve problems using visual spatial strategies.
Okay. So one very interesting book of yours I've read is The Evolution of Vulnerability. And as far as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, as you say in the book, men and women have sex-specific vulnerabilities that correspond to their main cognitive, reproductive, and physical abilities that are different between the sexes, right? So, what are these main differences, first of all? And in second place, what In what ways do our studying of these vulnerabilities aids us in giving more strength to the findings we get from other areas and other disciplines in terms of the sex differences?
Sure. So the basic argument there is that due to sexual selection, so competition for mates or mate choices or other things that result in the evolutionary exaggeration of sex differences. So in humans, men are taller than women, for example, and that's probably due to a history of male-male competition. So men have certain physical and cognitive advantages, and women have other advantages that can be understood from an evolutionary perspective. My point in that book and some follow-up studies is that a lot of these advantages often result in vulnerabilities. So a lot of these traits are exaggerated in one sex or the other, as I mentioned. And that exaggeration means that they require more resources, more calories, more nutrients, longer developmental period, and so forth to fully develop. And if anything goes wrong during that time, or if there's poor nutrition, poor calories, or whatever, then the sex that needs more to fully develop it is going to be hurt more by these deficits. So for instance, with the height difference, the differences, there's small differences in childhood, but they really emerge during adolescence, where males have an extended growing period during adolescence. And chronic disease or poor chronic nutrition during that time affects the growth and adult height of both men and women, but it has a much larger effect on men than women. So men are disproportionately, shorter relative to other men than women are when they're growing up in these difficult circumstances. And so we see the same thing with cognitive abilities. So girls and women generally have advantages in language. For instance, most of the individual folk psychology skills that we talked about earlier, girls and women have advantages in, which is good. But those advantages might also result in vulnerabilities under difficult conditions. And so, for instance, prenatal exposure to cocaine, which disrupts cellular energy production prenatally, results in more language deficits in girls than boys, because their language system is, it has more brain tissue devoted to it, probably more white matter and other sorts of things, that everything has to go right to give them that advantage. And if there's problems, such as toxin exposure early on, or other kind of nutritional deficits early on, it actually affects girls more than boys. Boys tend to have advantages in men in the folk physics areas that I mentioned. And toxin exposure, or even growing up in chronically stressful environments during childhood, affects boys and men's visual spatial abilities much more strongly than it affects girls and women's visual spatial abilities. We see similar things with Alzheimer's disease, possibly with Parkinson's disease, and a variety of things. So my basic argument is that by taking an evolutionary perspective and understanding what men and women are good at and what boys and girls are good at, we can predict a priori how prenatal exposure to certain types of toxins, how chronic social stressors, how malnutrition, which is common, or chronic parasitic diseases, which is common throughout the developing world, are going to differentially affect boys and girls and men and women. We can also use this effect, this basic phenomenon, to better understand the effects of toxin exposure, either prenatal or postnatal exposure. So if you look at, say, mom's prenatal exposure to a variety of chemicals, we're all exposed to a variety of chemicals, and most of them are fine, but a certain subset of them can have problems. And we look at, say, girls' visual spatial abilities, we probably wouldn't find much effect. And we might conclude, well, this toxin's fine. It's not really a toxin. It's a chemical. You're exposed to it. No big deal. But if we look at boys' language development, we might say the same thing. But if we look at girls' language development, we may find a different pattern, that there actually are deficits, and same with boys' visual spatial skills. So a lot of potential toxins, I think, are missed because you're not assessing the right things, you're not assessing the most sensitive things, or they're underestimated because the measures you're given aren't that sensitive to them.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, is that these vulnerabilities that are different between the sexes, they are as they are because they affect what has been selected in terms of intersexual competition and also via sexual selection.
Right. That those processes result in bigger, more elaborated traits. The more elaborated traits require more to build and maintain. So anything that compromises the ability to build these or maintain them is going to affect the bigger traits more than the smaller traits. And so if one sex has better abilities in one area, stressors are going to undermine those more in the sex with the advantage than the other sex.
Mm-hmm. Right. So just before we get into the work you've been doing on education and so on, there's this difference between biologically primary and secondary information. So what is the difference between them, these two things, and why is it so important for us to understand this differentiation in order to better understand human cognition and even perhaps to improve children's learning in the education system?
Right. Yeah. So I made that distinction quite a while ago in my first book, Children's Math Development, and in a follow-up article in American Psychologist, and argued that it's really important to discriminate between these primary abilities or the folk abilities, say language, and biologically secondary kind of school-based competencies that are built on primary systems, because it has strong implications for how we educate children. So language is a primary ability or folk ability. It's kind of a universal, so forth. We know that reading is built onto the language system. So, they're basically more or less the same brain areas involved there. But to learn to read, you have to have explicit instruction on phonemic awareness, word decoding, word recognition, and so forth. And that just doesn't happen unless you go to school to learn how to do that. Now, that distinction is important because in the U.S., at least, there was maybe 20-some years ago, or a little bit longer than that ago, there was a movement called whole language, where the basic assumption was that children would learn to read, learn to write, learn to spell correctly, and so forth, in the same way that they learn natural language. So in natural language, they're embedded in social contexts, and it just kind of emerges there. And so they assumed that if we put kids in schools, we surround them with books, we let them see adults reading books and so forth, just give them the exposure that they're going to learn to read and write and so forth without any teacher-directed instruction. And it was a disaster. It just did not work. The same approaches have been tried with math, and they don't work either. And so making this distinction between the primary or folk abilities and the school-taught abilities is real critical, because their acquisition in kids occurs very differently.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that primary biological components, let's say, could help us in trying to devise at least better environments for the children to learn in?
Yeah, so good question. So as I mentioned earlier, girls have advantages in these folk abilities, folk psych abilities, and language is one of them. So girls have earlier language development, they have better sensitivity to phoneme discrimination, and so forth. And those language abilities allow them, make it easier for them to learn how to read. So to break down words into sounds and to learn to discriminate the sounds associated with their different letters and symbols and so forth. And that contributes to a worldwide advantage of girls in reading, fluency, comprehension, and so forth. So one implication of that is that if we were just we know nothing about reading or anything like that. We know that girls are better at language. We know that reading is built on the language system in part, and so we would anticipate that boys are going to need more explicit, direct instruction in things like phoneme discrimination, phonological awareness, word decoding, and so forth. And in fact, they do need that, but they don't get it unless they're identified as having reading problems. But the average boy doesn't get it. But from this perspective, the perspective I'm talking about, we would just assume that most boys are going to need something additional for reading. And we could make the same argument for girls and women when it comes to visual spatial aspects of mathematics. And so, on average, there's not a big sex difference in math. But when we look at the visual spatial dependent areas, there is a difference. And part of the difference resides from boys and men are more likely to spontaneously use visual spatial strategies to try to solve certain types of math problems. Women are less likely to spontaneously use the visual spatial and more likely to use a language-based strategy, which in some cases just doesn't work as well. But you can teach women and girls to use these visual spatial strategies. They just need more direct instruction. They need to be shown on average how to do it. With a little practice, they can get pretty good at it. But a lot of people deny that there are sex differences in these areas, and so they don't want to admit that and take that just kind of pragmatic approach. Okay, there's differences here. There's something we can do about it in terms of school learning. Let's just do it.
So do you think that this knowledge is important, particularly to try to level the field in terms of if we know that boys learn these things easier and girls learn those things easier, that we can compensate in both sexes for the skills they lack innately, let's say?
Yeah, I think so. You can, but it's not done, because a lot of people are reluctant to admit that girls have advantages in some areas and boys have advantages in other areas. Or what they do is try to compensate and increase girls' visual spatial abilities generally, which maybe you can do a little bit, but they're still not using those to spontaneously solve certain types of math problems. I mean, you just kind of, girls need to learn how to plot and graph and understand these things. You just teach it directly. Mm-hmm. And same with boys reading.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And why do you think mathematics is one of the disciplines where students tend to get the worst results? Because, I mean, can we establish an evolutionary explanation for it? Is mathematics particularly counterintuitive in comparison with other disciplines?
Yeah, I think so. I think the gap between evolved language competencies and reading is, I mean, there's a bit of a gap. You need to learn how to do it. But when you read, you're essentially talking to yourself, right? And you're developing mental models of your reading and literature thing. You're using your theory of mind to understand characters and such. So there's not a huge gap there between our folk abilities. And once we get good at reading and reading comprehension, there's a bit of it there. So you need schooling, but it's not huge. But when we get to mathematics, the gap between our inherent number sense and, say, algebra is huge. It's a very symbolic system. It's a system within itself. It involves, basically inhibiting all of your folk biases and learning this logical mathematical system that has all these abstract symbols that have no meaning outside of the context of whatever form of mathematics you're learning. So it's probably one of the most abstract, difficult, and remote from our folk abilities disciplines that we have, which is why it's so hard and why we expect it to be hard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, you were going to say something else, or?
Yeah, and one of the things that some educators try to do, at least here in the U.S., is try to make mathematics fun and enjoyable for kids. And from an evolutionary perspective, we wouldn't expect that. We wouldn't expect it to be fun for most kids. And to make it fun, you have to make it more similar to primary types of activities. But it's very distant from primary activities. So I think the more you try to make it fun, the less rigorous the mathematics becomes. And it takes a lot of work, a lot of practice, a lot of homework, and so forth. It's not fun.
And about it being fun, it is a good segue for the next question. That is, what evolutionary role would you say play as in children's development and in children's learning? Because is play important mostly for children to acquire social competencies and learn how to move in their social environment? Or can play also play a role in acquiring certain academic competencies?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think play is critically important for kids. It allows them to learn a number of things, regulate their emotional states. It allows them to learn about themselves, learn about how, social dynamics work. It allows boys to do a lot of group level play. It allows them to kind of organize themselves. They imitate older kids and adults in traditional contexts and learn how to hunt or do whatever people are doing in those types of context through imitation and play. So it's very, very, very important. Child-directed play, I don't think, in fact, I'm pretty certain that it is not going to be helpful for learning something like high school algebra. But it might be helpful early on in the learning process. So we're looking at preschool young kids and incorporating adult directed or guided play to learn numbers, numerals, letters, and so forth. So I think early on in the acquisition of secondary or school taught abilities, you can use children's play as long as it's guided and structured in some way to start to get the basics down. But free play won't do it.
Exactly. So, and because boys and girls and men and women have these cognitive differences, you already talked about some of them. Men are superior to women when it comes to visualizing, mentally rotate and transforming 3D objects, for example, and men are less verbally fluent than women. That's another example. So do you think that, and this is perhaps a somewhat controversial question, that teaching should be tailored to boys and girls?
Well, I think that, there's a lot of controversy around kind of like same-sex schooling sorts of things, and I don't think there's good evidence one way or the other. And boys and girls need to learn the same things. But I think in certain areas, as I mentioned, we might anticipate that boys and girls need to learn phonemic awareness, kind of what letter sounds doing, word decoding, and so forth. But girls on average are going to pick it up more quickly than boys. And so we might anticipate that, you don't necessarily need to do something different, but boys may need a bigger dose of that particular thing. And the same for girls, for certain visual spatial aspects of mathematics may need a little bit more of what everybody else is getting.
Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't say that segregated learning would be justified in any way, right?
Yeah, I don't know about segregated learning because in a lot of areas, I mean, once boys and girls are fluent readers, I mean, they're both learning history and geography or whatever it is they're taking, and there's no need for sex-specific instruction in those areas. It's just in a few specific areas, I think.
Mm-hmm. And about what some people espouse to be the best way to teach children and adolescents and for them to learn. I mean, there was another book edited by you that I read, Evolutionary Perspectives on Child Development and Education. And in a chapter of it, I think it was Peter Gray, a colleague of yours, that talks about the observations he made at Sudbury Valley School. And what he basically defends is that, based on the idea that children would naturally look for older children and adults to learn from them and acquire the essential knowledge to be able to survive in their particular society, let's put it that way, that this would be pretty much enough for them to develop the necessary academic competencies. You already commented a bit on this, but what would you say about that?
Yeah, that's Peter's argument, and he believes that if you put kids in a social context, have academic materials available for them, that they will eventually seek out older kids or whatever to help them learn those things. And it's certainly the case that some kids and some people can learn a lot of things on their own without going to school, but the majority don't. I mentioned the reading wars, where his approach was more or less tried in elementary schools in the U.S., and a lot of kids just didn't learn to read. Now, he would argue that's because that was a standardized school curriculum, where rather than a kind of free-flowing sort of thing at the schools that he studied. But the work by the U.S. Reading Panel and other studies suggest that for the majority of kids, that kind of free-flowing context just isn't going to work very well. And other studies of kids who are have difficult time learning mathematics also find that the more explicit, the more structured the instruction, the better they do. So I just it may work for some kids, and a lot of those kids in the school that he talked about. I mean, it's a very wealthy area, and I suspect that a lot of the students have a lot of home support as well for their learning, and they're probably pretty competent, cognitively competent, so forth. And so it's not a random sample of kids.
Mm-hmm. Right. And would you say that, I don't know if you already thought about this before or not, but that perhaps this approach that Peter Gray talks about in the book could be helpful at least to certain specific types of children. Let's say, for example, that the ones that are not very conscientious and not very agreeable, and that would possibly prefer this type of environment of simply going to an adult and ask them to learn certain things that they are specifically interested in. Do you think that this could make sense or not?
Well, yeah, I can imagine that most kids would prefer that type of context where they kind of have control of what they do and when they want to learn to read and when they don't want to learn to read and so forth. But I don't think kids have enough foresight to understand what they need to be successful in a modern world. I mean, you know, the world is changing. The difference between what it takes to be successful today and what it took to be successful 10,000 years ago is very different. And children's preferences, motivations, learning biases, and so forth are designed for a more traditional context, and learning what you need in a more traditional context, and not learning algebra or technology or other types of things that are going to make them successful in a modern context.
Mm-hmm. And so, would you say that that is true because the things that kids, let's say 10,000 years ago or more, looked for to learn from older people were things that they were innately predisposed to learn, and that nowadays most of what people have to learn at school is very distanced from those sorts of things?
Right, and that gets at the crux of the argument between Peter and I, and even David Sloan Wilson agrees with Peter on this, is that it's clear. I mean, there's a lot of observational studies of kids in traditional cultures, and there's not much direct instruction by parents. It's a lot of social play and observation of older kids and adults and imitation and so forth. There may be a little bit of instruction here and there by adults, but not much. But the things they have to learn there, like hunting, tracking animals, cooking, whatever tool making, whatever it might be, or physical skills. I mean, they're probably predisposed to be interested in those sorts of things and to learn them. Learning to make, bow and arrow is probably fairly complex, but it's not the same as learning a very abstract, evolutionary novel discipline like algebra. For example, the gap there between kind of what we're predisposed to easily learn and to think is fun, and what we need to learn in a modern society is very big. Now Peter and David would argue that it doesn't matter, that this gap doesn't matter, that they're going to learn whatever. But I just don't believe it's true.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that in more traditional / primitive societies, that the simple fact that children looked to other people, adults and other children, to try to learn from them, that would be enough for them to acquire all the competencies that they needed to survive and to reproduce? Or, for example, as you were talking about to build an arrow, would you say that simply by looking at other adults doing it that they would acquire that knowledge, or that they would need some sort of more directed learning from the adults?
Well, they seem to acquire most of it through imitation and just copying what adults do. I guess adults here and there will give hints, say, try it this way or try it that way, whatever. But it's not a structured type of instruction about how to do it. The kids go up and they learn it and imitate and watch when they want to, and adults will give some feedback here and there. They don't kind of set it up so kids learn it, and it seems to work. I mean, it takes a long time in many cases for people to get competent at these things, but that kind of process seems to work just fine.
Okay, so just before we finish, Dr. Geary, could you please tell people, if that's the case, what are you working on now, if you have another book in the making, and perhaps share with people where they can follow your work on social media and so on?
Okay, sure. I am doing a couple of things. I'm talking with my publisher about maybe doing a third edition of Male-Female. If they'll allow me to expand it. There's a lot more research now, and so I may or may not do that. I'm working on this sex differences and vulnerability work, trying to understand how, in one study, we're looking at binge drinking in young adults, and how that potentially leads to sex-specific cognitive deficits. Based on my model, so we're working on that. We've run one experiment that looks promising, and we're going to be doing some follow-up work on that one. I've been studying preschool kids' development of mathematical competencies, looking at the relation between this inherent number sense and their symbolic learning of numbers and number concepts. And just started a large-scale longitudinal study of kids or adolescents learning of algebraic concepts. So other than that, I'm just hanging out. Oh, and just finished co-editing a 5-volume series on mathematical cognition and learning, published by Elsevier. So the 5th volume of that should be out this fall. I don't actually do a lot of social media. I don't have Twitter, or I have a Facebook page that my daughter set up for me, but I never go on it, or I go on it occasionally, but not very often. But if anybody's interested, I do have a web page, or they can email me with questions. I try to respond to those.
Could you just tell people what is the address for your web page?
I think if you just, I don't remember it off the top of my head. I think if you just Google David C. Geary, University of Missouri, then it'll pop up. And I have links to my books and lists of articles and stuff. And some of the articles I have reprints on them there. And there's a lot of them on ResearchGate as well.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Geary, I would just like to ask you to keep on the line, because I will finish the recording, but stay on the line, please. And just to finish, I would really like to thank you for sparing a bit of your time to being here with us today. I really admire your work, so
thank you.
Keep on with it, and thank you again.
All right, thank you.
If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.